All right, so welcome, Aaron, to my Zoom meeting. And for my assignment, I just wanted to talk to you about one part of Asian American history that is often overlooked in a lot of traditional education, so high school, college, and it's definitely something that I didn't learn about, but I think is really important to not only Asian American history, but to all of American history. And it concerns the US versus Wong Kim Ark case, where there was the son of an Asian immigrant, two Asian immigrants, who was born in the United States. He was born in San Francisco. But when he left San Francisco to go to China on a trip, he was denied reentry. And eventually he gained reentry through his appeals and he gained citizenship rights. But before we even get to that case, I wanted to set up the context and the background surrounding the reason why he was denied reentry and the historical era of Asian American and Asian immigrant racism and some of the dissent that was going on in society at the time. So to set up why there were Asian immigrants in America during this time, there was a huge influx of Asian laborers in the late 1700s and all throughout the 1800s because of what was called coolies, which is not an accepted term now. But back then, it basically just meant indentured servants and really cheap laborers. And they were brought over through ships and really inhumane conditions where a lot of them died. They came as diseased. They worked under very poor conditions and for really, really bad wages.
Was that part of like how like I know like some of the railroads were built by a lot of like immigrant workers?
Yep, exactly. Yeah,
Okay.
so exactly. So during this time in the 1700s or in the 1800s, it was during the abolishment of slavery, right? So at the time, there was a really high need for cheap labor since all of these plantation workers, other fields and sectors of labor that had lost their huge source of labor through the no more use of slave labor. And so that's why we saw this huge influx of Chinese and other Asian immigrants come in working for what they called unfree labor, which would basically replaced slave labor and brought over these Chinese, a lot were Chinese immigrants especially. And it created this huge tension. So once they were brought over, like you said, they were working on a lot of the labor that was replaced replaced slave labor. But once the gold rush happened, a lot of Asian and Chinese immigrants came over to the West Coast for the gold rush, and that's where you saw. What's that?
When was the gold rush?
The gold rush was in the 1800s, like 1840s, and what ended up happening was the gold rush, which brought a lot of Chinese laborers as miners and stuff like that. The labor was replaced by big business. So big business took over the gold mining, and then you saw Chinese immigrants and cheap labor dispersing into other labors. So it was like there was a big market for them in laundry, especially in San Francisco, in the fishing market and the shrimping market, and also other fields like the railroads. And what ended up happening was that there was a huge sentiment that they were taking the white man's job. So there was less jobs available because there's so many Chinese immigrants that came over as coolies and as cheap labor. So essentially, once the gold rush and the gold dried up, there was all these Chinese laborers And the common sentiment by, the ignorant people back then was, okay, the Chinese have got to go. They're taking up the white man's job. So what ended up, what we saw happen was this sentiment translating into actual law, especially in California, where in 1852, there was the foreign miners tax, which put Chinese at a huge competitive disadvantage and taxed them just for mining. And then there was the 1858 barring of Chinese and Mongolian races. And then there was another Chinese banning against using certain nets for fishing. All basically, essentially, were laws that said the Chinese have got to go. They didn't want more Chinese labor over there because they were taking the Chinese job.
Yeah, so they're just trying to edge them out as much as possible to make it impossible for them to sustain and compete with.
Exactly. They were unable to compete, even though they were brought over most of the time without much of a choice.
So adding like a taxing to what was it, mining you're saying?
Mm-hmm.
So like, and that's even without like being like, they're not citizens yet, right?
No, they didn't have citizenship rights.
That's interesting. So they're just taxing immigrants to work.
Yeah, exactly. And because of the 1790 Naturalization Act, it said only free white persons could attain citizenship born outside the US, which set limits for Black Americans, indentured servants like the coolies, and then later on Asians. But getting to citizenship laws, at the time, America had adopted the British common law, which was called jus soli. It's Latin, jus soli, which is birthright citizenship, and jus sanguinis, which is the right of bloodline, which is clarified in two different laws. And this is where it becomes really important for Kim Wong-Ark's case and his case to attain citizenship. So in 1866, they passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and it said, all persons born in the US and not subject to any foreign power, excluding Indians not taxed, are hereby declared to be citizens of the US. So essentially saying that if you're born here and you aren't subject, loyal to another country's or emperor or ruler's power, then you are an actual citizen, as long as you weren't part of a hostile invasion or takeover, or you're not another government official. And then they introduced the 14th Amendment at the time. And this said, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, so subject to the laws of the United States, are citizens of the US and the state wherein they reside. So these two things are important because one of them introduces the right to citizenship by bloodline. So if your parents were born here, but you were born in China, because they were born in America, they pass their citizenship through their blood. So that's interesting to think about, because the other part is saying that if you're born here and you're not subject to another foreign power, then you also have, so it's like the location of your birth, your birthright citizenship.